I'm always going to do something crazy that Apple, may or may not think is a good idea. So if you run into the limits of their tool and of their capability, does it allow you to get out of it to fix it? I want to be able to access that directly, and so I try to get as close to the underlying technology as possible. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tessl, for inviting me to be here. Today, I'll give you a talk on how to build iOS apps with agents. My name is Vivian. I'm currently an iOS engineer at Meta. My day job is that I build both infrastructure and general context, skills, patterns to help agents work better in our custom iOS frameworks to enable iOS engineers to build apps faster at Meta. But generally, I've been a mobile developer for almost 15 years. I've worked with many different UI frameworks, platforms, and I'm a bit of an Android survivalist. Can't really do that much, but I think a lot of this will also apply to Android development as well, if you all are curious. So let's get into it. I'll save 5 minutes at the end for questions, and you can also find me after if you have any specific questions. So in the talk, I'll cover 3 different areas. The first one is what makes mobile development hard. So I've tried to frame this talk with the assumption that you all have tried AI agents, maybe with web development, maybe with full stack. And I'll talk a little bit about things that you might want to consider if you're jumping into building iOS apps. I will also share patterns and best practices. Now, these are observations and learnings from my many hours interacting with agents day to day, and also on some of my own side projects using open source tools. And then finally, I've actually prepared, hopefully, what is at least a getting started toolkit if you're starting from zero. But like I said, you can kind of mix and match, and I'll go into how you can maybe build some of your own tools as well to make mobile development easier with agents. All right, let's get into what makes mobile development hard first. So you may or may not be familiar with the iOS ecosystem specifically, but some things I want to call out that are quite different than a lot of web and full stack frameworks that exist out there is Apple and Android are fundamentally closed source ecosystems, iOS more so than Android. And this, you can imagine, affects how these foundation models are trained. So they just have less access to the underlying code. There are proprietary operating systems and platform APIs, and the tooling and the languages that are used, I've tried to show all of the nice icons here, are very specific to both the platform and also even, for instance, iOS 26, very different APIs that you might have to interact with. In addition, something that is a little bit different on mobile is Apple and Android are much more cavalier. They still try to do a good job being backwards compatible, but there are breaking changes that happen version to version. If you were developing on the early days of Swift, you might remember, migrations from Swift 1 to Swift 2 to Swift 3. It was just like completely different. They even had to build tools to help you migrate, and this was before agents. So you kind of had to try to do it deterministically. So there's these yearly major releases that, again, often introduce breaking changes, regular API deprecation for old versions, and in my experience, they do their best, but a lot of the nuances and details of the platform APIs are often not documented, and because you don't have access to them, the community also has a lot of trouble understanding what's going on. So just a quick overview. Finally, some things to think about as you are putting together your plans for building a mobile app is there's much more device fragmentation. I didn't even put on here, these are all form factors you might have to think about for iOS. There's also the Apple Vision Pro, which they also include in some of these screenshots sometimes. So there's phone, tablet, and watch form factors, and then on top of that, there's also different UX paradigms that they really try to emphasize for these different form factors. So we'll talk a little bit about how you might deal with that or reduce the scope to make the agent more successful. And finally, something to consider is people now, some still upgrade their phones yearly, but your devices tend to be locked to a certain OS version, maximum OS version, to encourage you to buy new ones. And so, especially if you're targeting markets where people have less data access or are more price conscious, they might be on older devices and older versions. So that's also something to think about. And then finally, something that I work on day to day, I think about a lot, is mobile just has slow verification loops. On web, you can load up a web page, agents even can access them directly, but on mobile you're using custom proprietary tool chains, and we're still seeing new releases and new ways to access this for agents. So it's kind of a work in progress. A big one that you all might feel, at least if you are in the React or React Native world and going to vanilla iOS, is there's no hot reloading. There are some tools that make it easier, but basically you have to write your code, run a build, which may or may not take a couple minutes, and then look at a real simulator or even a real device and try and verify your code is working. So that whole loop is just slower, which produces more errors and more reliability problems. We'll talk about a little bit of this too, but on web, you have headless mode, so you can test UI without actually running it in a true iOS environment. You can't do that on iOS. You also can't replicate certain multi-touch gestures. And finally, if you're testing things like Bluetooth or location-based capabilities, you have to use a real device. So lots of complexity. And I'll try to simplify a lot of this today, but we can also talk more afterwards. Okay, another cool thing, I'm glad I'm giving the talk now because 2 weeks ago, Google published really the first comprehensive official benchmark for mobile development. You should definitely check it out. And part of why I want to go into this today is because it shows a lot of what the gaps are in the mobile ecosystem today. And this is published by Google. So if you look at the leaderboard, I'll break it down a little bit further, but one thing you might notice, of course, is their model's the best. That makes sense. But one thing I want to call out is the highest score is 72%. If you've looked at some other benchmarks like SwiftUI or whatever exists for the new frontier model releases, usually they're in the 80s to 90s. So already we're seeing a gap, and it's great that we're starting to measure where we are today, and it's still early days, so we're getting better. I'm going to focus on Opus 4.6, since that might be the one people tend to use these days. So what I did was I actually went into Android Bench, and I had AI categorize, okay, out of 100 tasks, what are the different categories we're actually testing? And I thought this was quite revealing because you can see there's a lot of things that you might have to think about for mobile development. And just focusing on the top left, UI, there's 25 tasks. That may seem like a lot, but at Meta, for our internal UI frameworks, we have just gotten started on measuring effectiveness, and we're already at 100 plus prompts just for UI and layout. So again, we're very, very early days. This is just a kind of broad overview of how the models are doing, but we can probably get more specific and granular for these agents. Another thing I want to emphasize, and this is echoed in my practical experience, maybe you all have seen this too, is because a lot is harder to verify on mobile, you also see very, very different performance across different kinds of tasks. So architecture and dependency injection, not too bad. But if we go into the lower levels like device and media, builds and migrations, you're going to see a lot more errors. And again, this is Opus 4.6, so very, very high-performing model on general software engineering tasks. And these are just aggregate numbers based on the categories. I was really curious how it performed on specific tasks. So I actually downloaded the data set and did an analysis. And this is across 10 individual runs on the same task. And what I want to point out is, something like Bluetooth, Claude failed 100% of the time. And I don't know about you all. I don't know if you've tried using the Bluetooth stack. It's really, really hard. I don't think I could figure this out as a human, so I get it, Claude. It's very difficult. This is great, though, because at least we now have a measurement, and we can, as a ecosystem, as a community, improve from here. But I just want to show, again, the success at what the agent might be good at for mobile development will vary quite a bit. But it is good at a lot of stuff. So where are we on iOS? I talked a lot about Android. Interestingly enough, I have the slides if people want to check it out after. React Native, CallStack actually released, they're a company that does React Native visibility, I believe, but they also released benchmarks on the same day 2 weeks ago. So we also have some signal for React Native, but on iOS for Swift, we actually don't have any robust benchmarks yet. The best is in May 2025. Some researchers released 28 handcrafted examples, but this is already out of date, doesn't test the latest models. So we're just getting started. I'm really excited that we're starting to measure this and overall improve as a mobile development community. So hopefully I've given you a sense, like if you're struggling, honestly, that makes sense. There's a lot that we don't even know what the gaps are yet for agents doing mobile development. So the first step is understanding where we are, and then we can start to get better. But I think at least playing around and talking to other mobile developers and even just comparing web and mobile experiences, I can share some patterns that I've already seen. So going back to maybe my earlier slides, the most crucial thing, in my opinion, is you have to set up a verification loop, because the agent, without any underlying knowledge in those frontier models, I have seen, especially on mobile, that there are endless failure cycles. Usually if you have a good model like, or harness like Claude Code, it will eventually stop and say, I don't know, you try, sorry, I can't figure it out. But I've seen this much more frequently on mobile than on other stacks or when doing web development. So creating that loop where the agent can check itself with real generated UI or interactions with the simulator is really, really important. And I'll talk about how to do that. And so the more signals it can gain to check itself, it actually can start to recover from mistakes and make up for the lack of knowledge in its model weights. Kind of related, but so I would say focus on creating that verification loop. But secondly, you all might be thinking, hey, this is a talk on iOS. I also think React Native is actually a really good option if you want to do mobile development. You are able to ship cross-platform, just writing one app in React Native. But what I want to call out is the agents can't make up for fundamental limitations in the frameworks. I worked in React Native full-time for a couple of years. And I would not pick it if I'm doing high-performance scrolling infinite feeds, right? You're having to go back and forth across a JavaScript bridge. It's naturally going to have more latency. So as much as possible, understand the technologies and the platforms you're picking, because that goes into my second and third point. There's not a lot of context that comes with a model. So you need to start building that up over time. So choosing your stack is really useful, so you can start building your own skills and your own tools and your own rules. But also, this is something we've tried at work, and language-to-language translation just multiplies complexity. So if you have a React Native app, it does not do well if you try to translate it into SwiftUI. We're not even talking about yet like iOS to Android, although that's or vice versa, although that's something people are very interested in. There are ways to make it better, but just as a flag, converting later might be very difficult, and you might just be better off starting from scratch. Okay, so I've told you what to pay attention to. What should you do? My best recommendation here, and the best practice, is actually just try to get as clear as you can with your project scope. So this is just a kind of picture of all things you could decide. So how many form factors are you going to support? How many OS versions are you going to support? Again, because people might not upgrade to the latest version or might not have the latest device at all times. Should you support rotation? How do you support local storage? There's a couple different options you can have in iOS. What kind of capabilities, and which capabilities require permissions, and then do you worry about data and offline? Generally, my recommendation is if you're just prototyping, if you're just getting started, try to limit the scope as much as possible, and it is easier to add on more functionality later than to start really broad and then have to figure out, why is my UI look weird on iPad when you weren't paying attention to it. And then finally, before I get into maybe some concrete, like what settings and technology you should use, I will say planning is key. I think the best results you get are from combining really, really well-defined specs or project plans with a verification loop that works. So the agent knows what it's trying to do as clearly as possible and then can check its own work. And actually, if you're doing language-to-language conversion, what we found, so we try to convert SwiftUI to our in-house declarative UI framework, and we found it was better to take the SwiftUI app, create a spec, and then give that spec to an agent with the context of the other framework to re-implement, because it just got really confused having access to the code directly. So I think that's really interesting. This might change, again, as frontier models get better and just can understand mobile development from the get-go. And then finally, I think you should build your own tools. So I'll talk a little bit about how to do that. Finally, one recommendation, you all might be familiar with this kind of workflow, but this really works for me. So I have kind of a task workflow that, again, has the validation and verification built in. But one thing I've noticed is over time, there might be aggregation of errors or complexity, or the agent might not know how to stitch things together. So approximately every 3 or 4 tasks, I try to run kind of an expert review flow to overall identify issues in the code base, clean things up, and that's where I try to update any skills or docs. I find this is just a little more manageable, but try out what works for you. All right, last section, just a time check. Okay, great. Now, I've given you both the high-level problem area, talked about some best practices, but you might be like, Vivian, I just want to build a mobile app. What do I do? So I've tried to give you a template to get started. You can check it out. It's called SwiftUI Agent Toolkit. And if you look at it, I'll kind of give you an overview of what it is. It's actually pretty basic, which I think is pretty cool. So you can get started with not that much baked in. So on the right is a picture of how that template works. But what it is essentially like an empty skeleton. It has some skills, a plugin that I wrote, some docs on how to set things up, and a place where you can build your Xcode project. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about why I think this kind of works better than just going straight into Xcode. So in terms of the agentic setup, this of course will change probably in the future, but I get great mileage out of Sonnet 4.6. I'm also pretty cheap. I don't use Opus a lot, or 4.7. So Claude Code is great. You can also use it directly, but if you want an IDE, Cursor works. VS Code also works fine. So having that default agent is helpful. And this is the most important part. Xcode Build MCP is actually an open source tool that someone has created. I see some people nodding. That hooks into the verification loop. So it can talk to a simulator, it can click around, it can take screenshots and show it to you. It's really, really great. And I'll put my money where my mouth is and show you the 2 tools I built 2 days ago for this talk, which is a plugin and a skill. And then for Xcode, what I would recommend if you're getting started is use SwiftUI. It's what Apple is pushing as the future anyway, and declarative UI is where the whole mobile development ecosystem is moving towards. If you aren't familiar with iOS, you also have to pick a minimum deployment target. This is like the lowest OS level your app will support. I just recommend picking the last two. You could pick iOS 26, which is the current version, but basically the last two versions give you enough information out in the wild so that the agent knows what's going on without having to be locked into the very, very newest APIs where it might run into more issues. So I just found that to be the best. And again, limiting scope, I'd say just do iPhone and lock the rotation so you don't have to worry about those things when all you want to do is try to build some really cool mobile apps. Cool. So I'll show you these tools that I built. Definitely check them out and give feedback. They're not necessarily the best version of this, so I'd also encourage you to try and make some of your own tools. But these are pretty cool and already helpful for me. So the first one, again, is I'll show you a little bit of what the verification loop can look like. Let me speed this up a bit. So I didn't give much. OK, I can't figure this out. Hold on. Let's go to X. Okay, so this is the default Xcode build MCP tool. So what it'll do, I told it that I wanted to create a to-do app, and it has a keyboard, and it will even like type for you, hit the plus button, and take screenshots the whole time to make sure everything's working. So this is awesome. Like, I didn't have to manually click around and verify it myself. Something the tool doesn't do by default is it isn't aware of mobile conventions. So some things that I put into the plugin is like, hey, maybe check light dark mode, make sure it doesn't overlap the dynamic island on the top, and make sure if you put text on the screen, there's enough visual distinction from the background color, because colors can adapt based on light dark mode. So it's just a thin wrapper around the MCP tool, but again, you can start to see over time, as you get more familiar with mobile, you can add more and more context and more adhere to the iOS guidelines. So I'd really recommend you jump in and build your own tools. Another example skill that I baked into the toolkit is this placeholder images skill. So this is cool. I like to wireframe, so I just made this wireframe on the left, and I was like, how does the agent do if I just ask it to build this UI? The screenshot on the left is what it does on its own. It's actually pretty good. It goes to, I think it's called pick image, remote, like public domain image site, and downloads a lot of images. But you can see, it doesn't have any sense of what the images are. So I added a skill that all it does is it has pre-bundled avatar images, product images, some heroes, and landscape and architecture. And with very, very little additional prompting, with the skill, you can basically give it this screen, and the agent knows. It's like, oh, okay, well, that circle on top is probably an avatar, so it finds the avatar image. And these are all products, so I'm going to use the product images from the pre-bundled assets. So that's a very easy idea of kind of like design templates that you can build to make your initial prototypes much more rich and more realistic. And at least my workflow is I like to figure out all the UI and like where things look and try and experiment with mock data as much as possible before I wire up the more complicated like real data, networking, all of that. So again, with kind of only an hour or two of scaffolding, you can get a lot better results with your UI. Final thing, I don't know if people are already building iOS apps, but Xcode and Apple Intelligence has just launched. So technically, you can go into Xcode and use all their new AI tools. They currently support both OpenAI and Claude Code. And honestly, I think it's cool. Like, there's not much difference in quality. And for me, it's more of a usability thing. So the MCP tool already works for most of my use cases. The only one that Apple Intelligence gives you is preview support. So this is the ability to see the UI without having to recompile. So that might be a reason you want to use Apple Intelligence. some downsides is you have to use the latest version of Xcode. You're also locked into those agents, and you have to use their IDE. They have a bridge which allows you to tunnel to, or like send commands to Xcode, but it has to be open, and you also have to like approve a lot. So the developer experience is like not great, and I'm sure it will get better, but my recommendation is for now to use that public MCP tool because it can get you really, really far. And if you want to, there's actually some instructions and a skill in the toolkit if you were curious and wanted to try it out. So I think I am good on time. So we have time for some questions, but that's kind of a quick 101 on how to build iOS apps with agents. I hope you enjoyed. And I think we have time now for some questions.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Round of applause, please.
Thank you.
I don't know about you, but this has fired me up to write some apps now. That's it. I'm not doing anything else but doing apps now. Any questions? I'll bring the microphone to you.
You mentioned that you have an internal framework for UI. So you mentioned that you build the specs with SwiftUI and then give the specs to the agent. Do you think is that because the model has been trained publicly with SwiftUI and that's why you're having that problem? That's my first question.
Yeah, I can answer that. It's a combination of both. It's missing context about internal frameworks. I think any tech company of a certain size, as well as just smart, maybe very egotistical engineers is like, I can build it better myself. So we're sort of eating our words now. But yes, that's part of the reason. The other reason is actually developer experience and velocity. So one thing that we're seeing a lot is like designers want to jump in and vibe code directly, prototypes, which is really cool. But when you have a lot of custom on top of like Apple's custom tooling, at least Meta has additional like really, really complex build chains and custom IDEs even. We have our own version of VS Code that does all sorts of crazy stuff to make it work. It just gets very complicated for especially people who are not familiar with engineering. So prototyping with SwiftUI is a much more like familiar experience for someone who might be used to vibe coding on web. So you can use all your same tools. And if you have a verification loop, like I said, built, like you can use any IDE you want. So that's why we're seeing SwiftUI get built. And then we need to kind of figure out how to fit that into either our existing apps, which don't use SwiftUI, or think about how to bring those apps to the App Store.
And my second question is on this framework. So I'm assuming you guys have tried to build skills, maybe vector database, etc. So what's your experience with that?
Yeah, I think, so my answer might be a little bit different. So we do have a skill validation issue, is like, how good is the skill that you wrote? Tessl's trying to solve that, I know. But at Meta's scale, because we have tens of thousands of engineers, we actually have an additional problem, which is like too many skills are being written. And I don't know if you've read about how Meta's code base is structured. We have a single mono repo for mobile and web and our backend infra, and you can imagine that causes a lot of interesting effects when an agent can kind of look at everything and also doesn't know what it's looking at. So to answer your question, yes, we're kind of exploring all the different options right now. And then one thing, which I didn't get to in this talk, but part of the reason like building your own tools is really valuable, and I extend that to you should change the code as well. So one of the things we're thinking about is, hey, our UI declarative framework is pretty close to SwiftUI, but it's different in important ways. So what if we lean into making it more similar to SwiftUI so the agent gets it right the first time instead of having to fix it later? So it's a good question. And I think if you talk to me in another couple weeks, I'll have even different answers because it's changing day by day. Thank you, that's a great question.
Hello. Thanks for the session. You are a native iOS mobile app developer, so I think the tool stack you picked, it is developer friendly. And just curious, I think Replit also is going, like they are like encouraging people to develop iOS apps using that agent. Just curious to know your thoughts, like how do you compare Replit agent with
That's a great question. I think honestly, you should try whatever tools work for you. I haven't tried Replit specifically, but I kind of think about it the way I think about React Native. And I might be a slightly controversial iOS engineer, but I'm actually not a purist. I think React Native is awesome. And part of what it's doing is it's solving a real business problem, right? A lot of people don't want to write a separate iOS and Android app. So I think Replit, and I think there's like Bolt and all these other services that help you both build an iOS app and also get it to the App Store. That's another part I didn't cover here. That's a huge pain point as well. I think that's great. The risk that you run when you use anything that's kind of further away from the underlying bare metal is when you do need to say, okay, Replit doesn't know how to do Bluetooth. I'm going to pick on Bluetooth because it's so hard. You're kind of stuck, like you don't know what's going on under the hood. You might need to, I don't know if they have a concept, like in React Native, if you use Expo, which is now the official path, I remember when Expo was still optional. So Expo has this idea of like ejecting. So you can go from their managed environment to the underlying kind of vanilla version of React Native. So I don't know if Replit allows that, but that's the main thing I would think of is like if you run into the limits of their tool and of their capability, does it allow you to get out of it to fix it? Because if not, then you're kind of limited by just what they provide. And as a developer, that's the thing I always think about is like, I'm always gonna do something crazy that Apple, may or may not think is a good idea. So I want to be able to access that directly. And so I try to get as close to the underlying technology as possible. But that's a good question.
We'll take one more question. While I hand the microphone over, would you mind going back to the slide that had your GitHub repo on?
Oh, yes.
Because that would be really useful for people to take.
Yeah, check it out. Also, if you look at the slides or the video later, it has my email, so you can always shoot me an email, or we can talk after this as well.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Of course.
My question relates to specifically Claude.md files and skills. So let's say you have something working and then next week you're asked to do something else and now you have a different Claude.md file, a different skill file. How does Meta or how do you guys internally check whether the new skill.md file or Claude.md file you have is better than the previous?
That is a great question. So we do this through a combination of options, and I think it will also vary depending on whether or not you're an indie developer or at a big company like Metascale. I mean, the answer is evaluations is the only way you can get a reliable number of some sort because of the non-deterministic nature of LLMs. But this is a good question because even right now at Meta, it's very, very hard for us at scale to run end-to-end mobile evaluations because you need an actual simulator. So the way, or even a real device, right? If you're doing like full testing. So we're dealing with a problem where we just don't have enough devices like Mac OS environments to actually create simulators to do this at scale. And so the only fallback, honestly, I have is you try to generally create skills that optimize other skills or other ways to promote best practices. And then one thing we've been doing is actually building deterministic linters and other tools that will reliably run so that you remove some of the work that a non-deterministic LLM is doing and actually bring it back to a script or a linter or something you know will enforce certain classes of problems so you don't have to worry about those. So it's kind of a combination of all of the things, but evaluations are going to get you the furthest, honestly. And in lieu of that, manual prompting. is the answer, which is hard to scale.
Okay, thank you so much for answering these questions. Are you hanging around afterwards?
Yep, I will.
Great. So
Thank you,
can always
everybody.
catch up with Vivian. And I am also super glad that the answer to your final question was evals. Here comes Max with a talk about evals. Once again, final round of applause. Thank you so much, Vivian.